I'm going to apologize up front and give y'all a quick disclaimer. I started feeling with a pretty bad headache last night, and I woke up today with a splitting headache, feeling somewhat feverish, and when I arrived here, actually vomited. So I'm obviously not feeling fantastic. I have no idea if it's contagious, so I'm not going to touch anyone, but I'm having a very hard time this morning. If I just suddenly collapse into myself, my dad will just come up and take over. So you may get him today. We'll see how long I can make it. But I have no idea what's going on. My wife's been sick, but just like with a cold. And this is more than a cold. So I don't know exactly what's happening. But I'm not in my A game. So if I say things that are crazy, someone just raise their hand and say, that didn't make any sense. But I'm going to do my best today. Whew. Struggle. So today we're going to pick up, we talked last time, Uncle Rob did his bit on the theology and how do we interpret the Bible and what does this have to say about Israel, Palestine, and interpreting biblical prophecies. And so now we want to pick up with a lot of the political history. So where does this story really begin for talking about the state of Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians? I think one of the questions at the very beginning of the class, the very first day, was basically how did Israel come to be? Like the Jewish people had left, how did they end up coming back? What were those chain of events? We're going to talk about that today, kind of telling that story. So, if I can. Ooh, man, having a hard time. So, when we teach on this, we like to talk about the conflict in three major periods. The first being the Zionist movement, which we're going to talk about today. The second being the wars between Israel and the Arab nations, and then the last period being the Israeli occupation, which should say 2017, still happening. So we're today going to focus in on this Zionist period and look at the rise of this political movement. So, in order to understand really most anything about this conflict, we have to understand this notion of Zionism. And to talk about Zionism, there's both this sort of historic Zionism and then the modern political movement of Zionism. Historic Zionism is the desire to create a Jewish homeland in ancestral Palestine. This has been a desire that has been around in the Jewish people for a very, very long time, ever since the diaspora in AD 70 and beyond, when they were driven out of the land, and there's been this desire to come back, to return to the land of their ancestors. A lot of the prayers will end in next year in Jerusalem. We're going to go back next year in Jerusalem. Dad, I think you're going to have to come up here. I'm having a very, very hard time. I don't know that I'm going to be able to make it. Actually, yeah. I'm very, very. This has never happened to me that I've gotten sick, but I am feeling absolutely awful. So I'm going to let Dad do this, and I'm just going to go sit down for a minute.
You might need to go home.
I might need to go. Well, Dad's a doctor. I'll let him decide if I need to go home. Anyway, yeah. All right. Here's the. And again, give him some grace because he was not prepared to do this, and so he's just filling in last second. And I may sit to the side and sort of pitch in if I need to.
Good morning. There was a time when I could say that most everything that Michael knew about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict I taught him. That time is long past. He's always very gracious to say that I know more about this than he does, and that's simply not true. I've spent my life traveling to Israel, and I spend a month there every year as a physician, largely looking at healthcare-related issues and humanitarian issues. So I know this background. I've taught it. I've dealt with it. But Michael's the historian. He's professionally trained. So I'm sorry. We're gonna drop the level down to the discourse just for a moment, and see if we can give him a break and get him through this morning. I think the message that Michael wants you to hear, that I would want you to hear, is what we know, what we're experiencing right now, this week. I mean, you guys have all watched the news this week. There was a stabbing at the Damascus Gate. Israeli soldier was killed. Israel closed off the West Bank, denied 250,000 entry permits into Jerusalem right now at the end of Ramadan. We're last week, the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, 50 years of occupation. This is an ongoing, real event in human history. One of the last colonial events in history that we're dealing with, that we're still in the midst of. And what he's hoping is that you can get a brief glimpse into the background of this and perhaps fill in some blanks of things that you haven't heard before, things that were glossed over in your history classes when you were in high school and college, things that don't show up in CNN or even in New York Times, certainly on Fox News, that don't show up on the news channels about the history behind what's happening. But it goes back, as you know, as he was talking about historic Zionism, this desire of the Jewish people to be in their ancestral homeland. As Rob talked about last week, there are only short periods of time when the Israelites had sovereignty over this land. So it's not as if we have a long period of history in which the Jewish people had sovereignty over historic Palestine. But there has been, since the diaspora in 70 AD, this desire to go back. As Michael was saying, Hashanah Haba Be Yerushalayim. That's the end of the Passover prayer every year. Next year in Jerusalem, in Hebrew. Next year we will be in Jerusalem. That took a massive leap forward with the persecution of the Jews that occurred as a result of the pogroms in Eastern Europe. So you've seen these images. Some of you probably have seen Fiddler on the Roof. If you haven't, I would put that on your list of movies to watch this summer to give you some historical background. It's a wonderful representation of what was happening in the life of the Jewish people during this time as they were persecuted. So you have the pogroms happening in Eastern Europe that led to what's called the first Aliyah. Aliyah is the Hebrew word for ascent, for going up. So in Israel, everyone goes up to Jerusalem, not because it's in the north, but because it's at one of the highest elevations in the land. So wherever you are in the land, you talk about going up to Jerusalem. So to make Aliyah is to make ascent. It's to go to Jerusalem, to go up to Jerusalem. And the first historic Aliyah occurred in 1882 to 84 as a result of what was going on in Eastern Europe. And it led to immigration to Palestine. Again, even though what we've all heard all of our lives is there was never a place called Palestine, that's one of the myths that I hope will be shattered by this class. There was never a nation state with the name of Palestine, nor was there a nation state with the name of Israel before 1948. But Palestine as an entity has been well known in history. There are coins stamped with Palestine from the late 1800s, early 1900s. The area was known as Palestine, even by Jewish tourist agencies that were bringing immigrants from Europe to the Holy Land. They talked about going to Palestine. So Palestine's a place, and there was this major immigration and establishment of the first Jewish Zionist settlements. Many of the Western European Jews also wanted assimilation, but there was a lot of resistance to this as well. So the idea that there are two basic ways that Jews have thought about their involvement in Western liberal democracies over history. One is to assimilate, to say our being Jewish is an ethnic and religious identity. It's not our national identity. So we want to be Jewish French people, we want to be Jewish Americans, we want to be Jewish Russians, we want to be Jewish Polish people. We don't want to be known as Jews. And there are others who always segregated themselves, always separated by dress, by religion, by custom, by kosher laws, who always saw themselves as separate and did not want to assimilate. And we see that even today in Israel, which is trying to be a liberal Western democracy. There's a large portion of the Orthodox community that doesn't want to participate in that project. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to abide by the laws. They don't want their kids to serve in the military. They don't want to recognize Israel as a Jewish state because they're not going to do that until the Messiah comes, until the Messiah comes and declares a kingdom. So many Orthodox Jews in Israel today don't recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel, even though the state of Israel provides them with incredible protections and exemptions from tax laws and exemptions from military service. So there's this tension that's gone on historically between those who want to assimilate and become a part of Western democracies and say being Jewish is a small part of who we are, and others who would say being Jewish is what we are, and we don't want to assimilate. And that tension has led to some of the persecution. Doesn't justify it in any way, but it's led to some of the persecution because they have maintained this place of otherness in the Western democracies. So this increased this desire for a homeland, for a safe place where they could go and be away from persecution. It's a very natural desire for any people that have felt themselves to be in the minority and have felt persecuted. Where can we go and avoid persecution? Where can we go and be who we are, live the way that we want to live? But recognize that many other Jewish people said that's not the answer. The answer is not to go find our own place. The answer is to continue to fight for our rights in the countries in which we live and to be treated as equals in those countries. So Theodor Herzl is the father of modern Zionism. We're going to get into some details here where Michael is much more expert than I am in having studied this and dealt with it. But the Dreyfus Affair was one of the very important early events in this emergence of historic and political Zionism, where a Jewish officer was falsely accused of treason and banished. And it led again to this public tension between the political community, between the Western liberal democracy and the Jewish community. So in 1896, Theodor Herzl published this pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and he called for the creation of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. And for the first time really gave voice to this movement, this conversation that had been going on about going home to, it wasn't called Israel at the time, but going home to our ancestral homeland is the way to address our political persecution and what's happening to us in Europe. And at that point, the movement of historic and political Zionism began to take off. So the first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, 200 delegates, and they took a vote and confirmed that Palestine is the location. This is where we want to go. We don't want to segregate ourselves into a small part of France or go someplace in Africa. We want to go to what we consider to be home, to historic Palestine. Again, not everybody felt that way. You remember, this was a little place in the Middle East, not well developed. Not everybody was excited about the possibility of leaving their homes in Western Europe and going to Palestine. There's a very famous telegram from the rabbis after the Zionist Congress. So they sent, as I recall the story, the Zionist Congress sent rabbis to look at the Holy Land, kind of like the story in the Bible about Moses sending Joshua and Caleb, I believe it was, to the Holy Land, to Canaan, to look at the land, and they came back and said, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are these giants living there. So the rabbis from the Zionist Congress went and looked at Palestine, and they sent this telegram back. Said, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. So it's obvious what that means. It's like, yeah, this is a lovely place, but unfortunately, we weren't told that somebody else is living there. The bride has a husband, and the husband doesn't want to leave. So there's a people there who seem very, very happy. That led to, along this same time, the popularization of this phrase that you all have heard, from 1901, Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. Now, he didn't invent this phrase, as Michael notes here, it was borrowed. But it's a myth. It's another one of the myths that I know Michael wants to help dispel during this class. And we've all grown up with this. Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. And it simply is not true historically, as demonstrated by the rabbis who went to look. There were people living there. There are people there now who can trace their roots, their family trees back 800 and 900 years, a whole lot farther than the McRay family can go. We're lucky to go back and make our connection to Scotland, but we know somebody came over at some point. But there are people that can trace their roots back in the Holy Land 800, 900 years. So there had been a people there. It was never a land without a people. But the Jews were, in many of the instances, and many ways of thinking about it, a people without a land. But again, that was not the universal feeling of the Jewish people, that they needed a land of their own. So Zangwill later wrote in 1921, Palestine already has its inhabitants. The Pashalik of Jerusalem is already twice as thickly populated as the United States, having 52 souls to every square mile, and not 25% of them Jews. So we must be prepared either to drive out by the sword the tribes and possessions as our forefathers did, or to grapple with the problem of a large alien population. Now, I never saw this when I was growing up in Tennessee and studying history when I was at Vanderbilt as an undergraduate. Nobody quoted these sources. Many of these sources weren't available. They become available to us now through archives that have been released, through various things. Michael's going to give you a lot of material over the course of this class that has become into the public knowledge that wasn't available for when most of us were growing up. But this is prophetic. This is one of the early Zionist fathers who is saying there are a lot of people living there. It's a densely populated place, and the only way that we're going to take control of this land is either drive them out by the sword or deal with a large alien population. And I will submit to you that by the time Michael gets to the end of this class, you're going to see that both of these have happened. A large percentage of the population has been driven out by the sword, and there is a large alien to the Jewish people, population that lives there. And right now in Israel-Palestine, we're dealing with a situation where about 50% of the population is Jewish and about 50% of the population is Palestinian. And that's what's called the demographic issue. And Michael's going to talk about that as the class goes on. But we go all the way back to Zangwill for this prophecy that we're either going to drive them out by the sword or we're going to have a lot of non-Jewish people here where we want to live, and we're going to have to grapple with that. And it has become a major issue for Israel now at the 50th anniversary of the occupation to say, what do we do? How do we maintain our status as a democracy with equal rights for everyone, but try to be a Jewish state? And many would say that is not possible. It's not possible to be an ethnic state, religious state, and be a democracy, especially when the minority population will soon be the majority population, when the Palestinians will soon outnumber the Jews. How does a minority rule a majority? All the way back to the 1800s, this was predicted. Yitzhak Epstein, I'm not as familiar with this quote, but said he chided the leadership over this and said, overlooking the marginal fact that our beloved land there lives an entire people that has been dwelling there for many centuries and has never considered leaving it. We're going to see this come up again with Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion, and other more modern Israeli authors and writers and leaders who are acknowledging that we have a fundamental problem, that there's a population here that doesn't want to leave. They're in our land, they've lived here for a long time, and they don't want to leave. So what are we going to do about that? So if we look at the land of Palestine, Israel today, historic Palestine, again, as Michael has showed you, we're talking about what's in green. It's what is internationally recognized as the state of Israel. Palestine today is about 22% of historic Palestine, so it's the West Bank and Gaza. Historic Palestine, we're talking about all of this land together with the Golan Heights, which belonged to Syria, but has now been annexed by Israel. So the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli people, consider the Golan Heights to be a legal part of Israel. The international community doesn't recognize that. The United States doesn't recognize that. But the Golan Heights in the minds of Israelis is no longer occupied. They've just annexed it. They have national parks there. They've changed all the names over to Hebrew street names. They consider it to be part of Israel. And so you have the Negev Desert. Here is about 6,000 square miles. Inhabitable area smaller than Connecticut. All of Israel, Palestine is about the size of Maryland or Vermont. Middle Tennessee, 17,000 square miles. So you can see, you can put that whole area into to Middle Tennessee. So we're not talking about a big place. Let's see if he's superimposing this. Yeah. So here you put the West Bank. You're stretching from Nashville to about Chattanooga. That's the land that we're talking about. It's a very, very small area, densely inhabited. Go back to 1878, the time that we're talking about, when these writers were talking about Zionism. You had about 450,000 Muslims and Christians and about 15,000 Jews. In 1922, the official British census during the time of the British Mandate is that there were about 600,000 Muslims, 71,000 Christians, who are again mostly Palestinian, and about 84,000 Jews as a result of the first Aliyah. So you can see that the vast majority of people who lived in the land at the time that the early Zionist writers were saying we need to go back, the vast majority of them were Arabs, Palestinians, either Muslim or Christian, with a very small minority of Jews. And Michael talked about this earlier, but I'll just make this reminder that language is problematic, and we're going to stumble over our words every time we talk about this. But when we talk about an Arab, in modern sociological terms, an Arab is simply someone who speaks Arabic. That's the only definition we have for Arab. We in the West like to lump everybody together who lives in Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Egypt. We'll sometimes even pull Turkey into that. The Turkish are not Arabs. We'll pull the Syrians, the Lebanese. We consider all of them Arabs. But in their minds, the only thing that draws them together really is Arabic. It's not even religion, because a large number of Arabs are Christians, different sects of Christianity. But the majority are Muslims. So being an Arab is not equal to being a Muslim. Being a Palestinian is not equal to being an Arab. But if you look at the census at this time, the large majority were Muslims, a small minority of Christians, and then about the same number of Jewish inhabitants. Most of the land, historic Palestine, was owned or controlled by the Arab population. So the question then is, how do we create a homeland, a Jewish homeland, that's inhabited by other people? And that remains the question in 2017, 50 years since the 1967 war. The question for the state of Israel still remains. How do we maintain our identity as a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, and be a part of the Western democratic community when we have this large population of non-Jews living among us who will soon be the majority population? And that is an existential crisis for the state of Israel that's hard to overstate. So the early leaders, Theodore Herzl in his diary in 1897 said, "We shall try to dispirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for them in the transit countries while denying any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly." So here's an early Zionist father who's laying the groundwork and saying the way we're going to deal with this problem is through economic exploitation, through economic immigration. We're going to drive the people out economically. We're going to create situations where they can get work elsewhere, deny them work here so that they will need to leave. Now, we hear echoes of this coming back in other times and other places. But we need to do it discreetly and circumspectly because nobody's going to like this. They're not going to... Yeah, do I?
That's evil.
It is in many ways evil. Herzl pursues diplomacy. He works with the Ottomans, trying to get land for a big debt payment. He works with the British. Uganda was offered as a temporary solution. I don't know how many of you know that from your history classes, but there was a time at which the Zionist Congress was given this proposal to go to Uganda, take a part of Uganda. It was a British colonial territory, had not yet been given its independence, so they could give it to whoever they wanted. They weren't planning to give it back to the Ugandans, so we'll carve off a part of it and we'll give it to the Jews and let that be their homeland. But that possibility died with Herzl, and everyone since then said, no, Palestine is where we want to go. So the Jewish National Fund declared in 1901 that all land purchased must always remain Jewish, and this has been a major instrument in the taking of the land of historic Palestine. The Jewish National Fund will purchase land and decide that in perpetuity it always has to be owned by Jews, and they've set up these intermediaries whereby land can be purchased without the people who are selling it knowing that they're selling it to Jewish individuals. This is going on today right now in the Old City. A few years ago, I was on a flight to Tel Aviv with a man that I got to talking to, and over the course of our several hours of conversation, he revealed that he was a part of one of these third-party organizations that was allowing him on behalf of the Jewish National Fund to purchase Arab homes, Palestinian Christian Arab homes in the Old City, and sell them to Jewish Israelis as a part of what's called the Judaization of Jerusalem. So that the historic four quarters of the Old City, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter, the goal is eventually it will all become Jewish, and that these Palestinian Christian populations will be driven out of the Old City. They do that by getting you to sell your land to me without knowing that you're selling it to a Jewish individual. So you sell it to someone who sells it to someone who sells it to someone, and eventually it ends up in the hands of a Zionist. So this dates back to 1901. Then you have the second Aliyah as a result of another wave of pogroms. Among these immigrants in the second Aliyah during this period was David Ben-Gurion. He came with a very strong socialist leaning and a desire for an egalitarian agricultural society, but runs solely on Jewish labor. And this is a very important part of the story, that these early socialist movements that helped found the state of Israel, the kibbutzim, the moshavs, these social communities where people lived in an equal way and shared property, was all predicated on the assumption that the people involved were Jewish. And they wanted to deny the local inhabitants, the Palestinians, the opportunity to work and to provide labor on that land. It was a part of this economic attempt to segregate the land and to move the Palestinians out. So, as you might imagine, that led to a degree of unrest among the indigenous Arab population who were saying, we don't own a lot of the land. A lot of the land was owned by absent landowners from the Ottoman Empire, people who managed land just like a lot of Appalachia today. I spent 20 years practicing medicine in Appalachia. There's a lot of land there that's owned by people who don't live there, and the people who live there live as tenants, renting their land from absent landowners. So this was happening, and the indigenous Arabs would erupt in violence periodically and say, we can see what's coming. We can see that there's this immigration of European Jewish people who are coming, taking over the land and denying us the opportunity even to work for them, even to be laborers in their farms. So then you have World War I. The Ottoman Empire is on the verge of collapse. The Ottomans made a strategic miscalculation and decided to put their strength with the Axis powers instead of the Allies. And when the war went against them, the Ottoman Empire collapsed after 300-something years longer. And then you've got the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And somebody has to decide what's going to happen to all this land. What are we going to do with all of the Ottoman Empire that stretches across North Africa, Turkey, East, including what's now Syria, Lebanon, the Mandate of Palestine, Jordan? All of that gets to be divided up by the victors, right? To the victor go the spoils. So the colonial powers who won this war are going to decide how to divide up the West. Now, what's happening here, the details of this are very detailed, and I know Michael can go into it in much greater detail than I can. But you've got this movement among the colonial powers in the Treaty of Versailles, I believe it was, at the end of World War I, who are saying we want to grant local governance to the people who were under the Ottoman Empire. As these Arab Muslim populations are being freed from the influence of the Ottoman Turks, we are promising them that they can govern themselves, that we're going to allow them autonomy. We're coming to the end of the colonial period. It's also during this time, from the 1920s to the 50s, that much of Africa the colonial powers are moving out, giving independence to the nations of Africa. So there's this movement across the Ottoman Empire to say, let's give autonomy, let's give sovereignty to the local indigenous populations. What happens in historic Palestine is much more difficult and complicated, and really is at the bottom of the root of what we're experiencing today. So the British Foreign Secretary, Balfour, said to Lord Rothschild in a very famous communication, the British government, quote, views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This is a pivotal moment in history where the colonial powers are saying to the rest of the Ottoman Empire, you're going to have self-rule. But in Palestine, saying we view with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They don't say that all of Palestine has to become that home. That's what happened. That's not what they said. But within Palestine, a national home for the Jewish people. But nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil or religious rights. That has happened. But they didn't say nothing will be done that will prejudice the political rights or the national rights. So they very clearly avoided the language of saying that we're going to grant to the Palestinians the autonomy that we're promising to the Saudis, to the Egyptians, to the Syrians, to the Lebanese, to the Iraqis. They don't say that. They do say nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights, and we know historically that hasn't happened. And this is a very important statement to appease the assimilationists, those who want to stay in Western countries and to assimilate. They're saying none of this should change the political rights enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So the fact that the international community is saying, let there now be a Jewish homeland, doesn't mean that we now get to kick all the Jewish people out of all the other Western democracies and send them to Israel because they have their own land. So this is a reflection of this tension that's going on in the Jewish community between those who say we don't want a state of our own because we're not a national people. We're an ethnic people. We're a religion. We want to be Jews where we live. We don't want to be seen as separate. And others who say, no, the only way to ever end persecution is to have our own state. I sat with one of my groups a few years ago in Beersheba, Israel, at a table with a Canadian Israeli Zionist who immigrated many, many years ago. He's the dean of a medical school now in Israel. And he said with great passion and great conviction, we, meaning his people, the Israelis that are Zionists, we have lost faith in the Western liberal democracies and their ability to protect us. We will no longer believe any Western liberal democracy that says we will protect the Jewish people from persecution. Therefore, we will fight to the death to protect this land that is now our land, where we can be free from persecution. You can understand with the history of Jewish people and their persecution why there is a group that feels that way. But there is another group very strongly feels, many in France and the United States, who feel that's not the answer. The answer is not to arm the Jewish people with nuclear weapons in the middle of the Middle East and say we're going to fight to the death to protect this. The answer is to keep fighting for our rights in the countries where we lived and where we grew up. So that tension exists. Lord Balfour went on to say, in Palestine, we do not propose to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants. That's striking.
That was one of their first problems.
That was one of the first mistakes. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Let that sink in for a moment. Maybe it doesn't need any more commentary. But this is one of the forefathers of Zionism, a British gentleman who is supporting this project, who says Zionism is more important than the rights of these 700,000 people who have lived here for centuries. And we don't really intend to consult them about what we're going to do. Vladimir Jabotinsky, any of you who've been to Israel will recognize a lot of these names. They're all over street signs all over Jerusalem. These are early Zionist leaders. Jabotinsky in 1923 said, Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. No way to do it peacefully, he said. We either do it against the will of the local people or we've got to stop this project now. And of course, that didn't happen, and it continues now in defiance of the will of the local people. So I would just insert here that when you hear and see these deplorable acts of violence that come out of oppressed communities, and Palestine is one of those, you will not hear any of us in our family ever justify violence against civilians. But understand where it comes from. Understand this place of great despair and depression that goes back to the 1920s, of a people who have lived in this land for centuries and who are being driven out and being denied political rights and are saying, we don't have any other response. We don't know what else to do. We don't have an army. We don't have nuclear weapons. We don't have the United States behind us. We have no power at the negotiating table. We have no chips to put on the table. We have nothing. Now, we can argue politically about how true that is and what other ways might better achieve those means. It's not a justification for violence. In my mind, there's no way to justify the violence of the state of Israel or the violence of the Palestinian people in response to that. But it comes from this place of despair and the fact that very on the Zionist leaders said violence is the answer to our problem. We will drive them out by the sword if we have to, because they're not going to leave peacefully. So here's what we're dealing with in modern times, but these nation states all were carved up from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. And you can see the zones of influence. Any of you who've ever been to Lebanon know there's a great French influence, the French language in Lebanon and Syria, English influence across the Mandate of Palestine, now Israel, Jordan, and Iraq. Great British influence there. This comes, I don't know if you've got the, well, this comes as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There's a lot that we have to abbreviate because of time, but there was it's been in the news recently as people have gone back and talked about the 50th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But this was an agreement between the French and the British, colonial powers, to divide up this area. And you can see why the British might want this land. India sits right over here. So they wanted a way to have a railway, to have commerce across the Middle East to connect the Mediterranean Sea with India, with their empire in India. And so they wanted control of this, the French demanded control of this area, and that's the way these countries were divided up. One of the reasons that Iraq disintegrated into civil war after Saddam Hussein was removed is because in the minds of Iraqis, there's no such thing as the nation state of Iraq. It's an imposition of the colonial powers. You have Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds, Christian populations, Jewish Iraqis. They were all created as a nation state at the end of World War I, held together by a dictator. When the United States went in and removed the dictator, the national identity collapsed. Why has Lebanon been in such a brutal civil war for so long? No identity as a Lebanese people. This was an artificially created land. Somewhat the same is true in Syria. Egypt is one of the few places that has this long history of what it means to be Egyptian. It's not dissimilar to what happened in the United States. 100 years into our history, what did we do? We fought a bloody civil war on what it meant to be American. Am I a South Carolinian first, a Virginian first, a Tennessean first, or am I an American first? We fought that war over terrible issues and over identity. And the same thing is happening in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, as these countries now, 100 years after they were founded by colonial powers, are fighting to say, who are we? What does it mean to be Iraqi? What does it mean to be Syrian? What does it mean to be Lebanese? The King Crane Commission in 1919 was appointed by President Wilson after World War I to inform American policy about the post-Ottoman people. What are we going to do with the Ottoman Empire after their fall, and their desired future regarding the League of Nations and the way that they would divide the territory. This was the first ever survey of Arab public opinion. First time someone said to the indigenous population, what do you want to have happen? So here's what the King Crane Commission said. We recommend serious modification of the extreme Zionist program. Why would they recommend that? Well, they went and saw what we've already talked about, that this is not going to happen without extreme violence. So we recommend serious modification. They began their study of Zionism with minds predisposed in its favor, but the actual facts changed their minds. One of the things that Michael often says is in his classes here, it's been very helpful for me to hear because I've lived this transition in my family. Michael kind of was born into this, but I've lived this. But I grew up in a family that was predisposed toward Zionism, predisposed toward the Israeli narrative, predisposed toward a traditional biblical interpretation of what should happen in the land of Israel. And it was only over the course of my adult years, starting really in 2000, as I began to travel and read, the internet was available, I found other authors, and I began to move into Palestine and into the West Bank and meet Palestinians and work with Palestinian physicians and hear this other narrative, that my mind was changed to say there is another story that doesn't invalidate the traditional narrative completely, but it lays another narrative alongside of it and says there's another story we need to hear. And what Michael discovered when he started investigating the King Crane Commission was that that's where they started. They started saying, we went into this with minds predisposed toward Zionism, but the facts in Palestine changed our minds. There is much to approve, they said, but it needs to be greatly modified. For a national home for the Jewish people is not equivalent to making Palestine into a Jewish state, nor can the erection of such be accomplished without the gravest trespass. The Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine by various forms of purchase. No British officer that the King Crane Commission consulted with believed that the Zionist program could be carried out except by the force of arms. What do you think happened to the King Crane Commission report?
Thrown away, buried, ignored.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, and he said, they recommend that only a greatly reduced Zionist program be attempted. Jewish immigration should definitely be limited, and that the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. So, what happened? The publication was suppressed. Not the first time or the last time in our history that we've suppressed a report that came to conclusions different than our government wanted, right? So this is a part of history that I didn't grow up hearing, that nobody talked about. These reports, I mean, all of this information is available. You can find all this. It's widely documented, multiple reliable sources. This is a part of history. But they said publication, the US government said publication would not be compatible with the public interest, or maybe more importantly, not compatible with the American national interest of what we wanted to see happen in this land. So from the 20s to the 40s, help me watch my time, Mike. The Arabs in Palestine began resisting. Again, is violence ever justified? That depends on where you are on the political spectrum, how you feel about national violence, about warfare, about about being a pacifist, about Christian theologies, all sorts of ways we can respond to that. But from the standpoint of the people who are being oppressed, resistance is existence. And that's a motto now among Palestinians. To exist is to resist. The only way we have to survive as a people is to resist the occupation. Should that be done peacefully? Should it be done in the style of Gandhi? Should it be done in the early style of South Africa, Mandela? Should it be done in, Mandela became a pacifist not because of some deep moral conviction, but because it was a strategic conviction. He was put in prison for bombing. That didn't work, so let's try a peaceful resistance. Lots of figures through history that have decided this strategic balance between violence and nonviolence with respect to resistance. But the resistance started early. Two major revolts, 1929, 1936. The British drew up the first partition plan, the Peel Commission, and look at what they suggested. So in red was the proposed Arab state, in light green or tan here is a proposed Jewish state, with this international corridor here as a British mandate. That's the Peel Commission, 1937. And you're going to see that the roots of that are what the United Nations eventually adopted. 1938, they reconsidered this partition and said it's impracticable to create Jewish and Arab states side by side in the same land. Why? Well, all sorts of reasons, but this history of the last 30 years is a big part of it, about the immigration and the violence, the expropriation, of the stealing of land, the movement of Palestinians out. So a white paper was published in 1939, a new British policy that was an attempt to meet many of the Arab demands, to control Jewish immigration, restricted land purchases, but both the Zionists and the Arabs rejected this. In much the same way that Israelis and Palestinians have rejected a lot of the peace deals that have been put on the table by successive U.S. administrations. This resulted in still more loss of Arab land, and it did not guarantee an Arab state to the Palestinians. So they said, why should we accept partition of the land? It's our land. We've lived here. The Europeans have come in and taken it. Why should we agree to partition of the land? The Jewish response was three-pronged: increasing immigration through illegal immigration, switching their imperial sponsors from Britain to the U.S. They said the British aren't so favorable anymore. Lord Balfour was, we got the Balfour Declaration, we got things started, but the British don't seem like they're on our side anymore. So we're going to switch and find an imperial sponsor in the United States. And then around 1945, the Zionist paramilitary organizations began to sabotage, bomb, and assassinate the British. It's another part of history that I just didn't know about growing up. The first terrorist activities in the Holy Land were committed by Jewish terrorists, not by Palestinians, not by Arabs. Any way you define terrorism, whatever term you want to use, but the aggressive, violent actions of a group of people who are fighting to throw off an oppression, who are fighting against an occupying power, and who are willing to do that by non-conventional military violent means. That started with the Irgun, the Haganah, the Stern Gang, with Jewish paramilitary organizations who were trying to throw off the British occupation. They were saying, we want this land. Lord Balfour in the Declaration gave it to us, and we're going to drive the British out by military force. And one of the most well-known of these examples was the bombing of the King David Hotel. If any of you have ever been to Jerusalem, you've probably seen this historic, lovely hotel. This is the hotel where all major international political figures stay. This is where U.S. presidents stay. But the south end of the hotel was bombed by one of the Jewish paramilitary organizations, killed a number of British soldiers, and it was a part of the early terrorist activities to drive out the British occupation. 90 dead.
What year was that?
That was, Michael, what year was that?
46, I think.
Yeah, it's the early 40s before the declaration of the State of Israel. So quotes from the leaders. Yitzhak Shamir in 1943, later became the 7th Israeli premier, said, neither Jewish ethics nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. First and foremost, terrorism, and these are his words, this is not language that's being put back. So in 1943, he's using the word terrorist. Terrorism is for us a part of the political battle being conducted under the present circumstances, and it has a great part to play in our war against the occupier. Do you want to take? Are you good?
You may not know exactly what's happening
Yeah.
next. Let me just try and just No, you don't have to take it off. That's just that part.
Can I ask you a question while you're?
Please, yeah.
I know this is a complicated answer, but just like you said, the only definition of the Arabs are those who speak Arabic. What is the official definition of a Jew?
We're going to come to that later.
Okay.
There's a week that Michael's away that I'm going to be speaking with
Okay.
preparation, and we're going to address that issue.
Yeah, just stay here because I'm not gonna. I just wanted to make sure you all knew what's gonna happen here. So this is Yitzhak Shamir. He writes this in a publication again in '43. Later becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. But he's saying that the idea of terrorism is not incompatible with Judaism, right? I mean, we see this also. Christians have used terrorism. Muslims have used terrorism. Jews have used terrorism. So part of the point is to say terrorism isn't uniquely Muslim, right? I mean, even someone like Yitzhak Shamir says this is just it's the way that we're fighting the occupier. So one of the things I say is that if you take out Jewish and put Muslim in there or Islamic, you feel like you could have a quote from Hamas. So, so this is the leader of Hamas. So if he said this, neither Muslim ethics nor Muslim tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. It's for us part of our war against the occupier. You would feel like that fits in pretty well with what Hamas says. And in fact, what he did say in 2014 was, we're not fanatics, we're not fundamentalists, we are not actually fighting the Jews because they are Jews. We do not fight other races, we fight the occupiers. I'm ready to coexist with the Jews, with the Christians, with the Arabs and non-Arabs. However, I do not coexist with the occupiers. So just to hear the similar language that exists both in the leaders of somewhere like Hamas and in the voices and words of someone who became a prime minister of Israel. The parallels are very fascinating. And this, I think, is just terribly, terribly fascinating. That in 1947, as all of these bombings are happening against the British, and as the world is watching from the United States, from all over, one gentleman, one Jewish American, writes in the New York Herald Tribune in a letter he calls a letter to the terrorists of Palestine. Now note a couple of things. First of all, it's called Palestine, right? He names it as Palestine. A lot of folks will say there's never been a place called Palestine. Well, in 1947, even the Jews of America were calling it Palestine. And he says it's to the terrorists of Palestine, which are not Palestinians, and they're not Arabs, they're Jews, right? That's who he's writing this to. So he says, every time you blow up a British arsenal or wreck a British jail or send a British railway train sky high, so on and so forth, the Jews of America make a little holiday in their hearts. Brave friends, we are working to help you. We are raising funds for you. Now, I'll quickly note that this sentiment was not shared by every Jew in America. In fact, one gentleman, a popular guy named Goldman, says this is disgusting. that's not how we act and how we speak. But then another gentleman, and this is very fascinating to me, another gentleman named Winchell responds and says, look, these Palestinian patriots, again, talking about Jews, are no different than our Minutemen, right? They're using the same tactics that we use, fighting the same people, trying to get the British out. Like, we know that story. We know how that goes. And so you can hear this, both the tension within even the Jews of America is saying, we support what you're doing, we don't support what you're doing, you shouldn't say that, I'm going to say it. And to say, this is very familiar to the story that we have experienced here in the United States. And so I put this in here to say, as my dad said, the earliest acts of terrorism in a place that we associate with Islamic terrorism were Jewish. Again, which is not in any way to say something condemning of Jews. It's just to say terrorism is not uniquely Muslim, right? We think of it mostly in that way because in the time that we're living, most terrorist attacks are committed, I don't even know if that's true, but the ones that we hear of the most are done by people who claim Islam, But there could have been headlines during the period of the KKK about Christian terrorism, and the period of the Inquisition, the period of the Crusades. 1940s, we're talking about Jewish terrorism. So just to keep in mind a broader view of what terrorism is. Great.
You're good.
Thanks.
You bet. So it's a fascinating story. How much time do we have?
7 minutes.
Okay. I don't know how far you want to get, but maybe we'll.
Say this, and then we'll.
Okay, we'll bring it up to here and say, I hope that you'll hear what Michael is saying, what I'm trying to say, and not hear what we're not saying. I'm not trying in any way to justify the stabbing of a female Israeli security officer at the Damascus Gate this week. I'm not trying to justify the rockets flying out of Gaza as an appropriate tactic, that we're not trying to justify the suicide bombing that went on in the Second Intifada. That's not the issue. But by the same token, I can't historically justify the words of the early Israeli prime ministers who said terrorism is a legitimate way for us to get the British out of this land. It's a legitimate way for us to throw off the occupier. I have to say there are other ways. There are other ways to deal with occupation. People are oppressed around the world in a lot of different circumstances, and there are ways to deal with that oppression. Sometimes they feel that violence is the only solution. But that's, as Michael said, that's not unique to Arabs. It is not unique to Muslims. It's not a part of Islam. This is a part of oppressed people feeling that they need to throw off an occupier. And it was very much a part of the Jewish story leading up to the formation of the State of Israel. So I think we're going to be off for 2 weeks for Michael Williams' retirement next week and then the holiday weekend. And then Michael's going to pick back up with this story. We know this story. This is a part of the narrative that we all know. But what happened with the Holocaust, with the end of the Second World War, the formation of the State of Israel, and the early history of the State of Israel. Remember that in 1947, the United Nations is going to divide the land, something similar to the Peel Commission, akin to, but along those same lines, they're going to divide the historic Palestine, and Israel declares its independence. That's celebrated as the War of Independence in Israel. It's celebrated as the Nakba, or memorializes the Nakba, the catastrophe by the Palestinians when 750,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and became the first refugees that have started this path of history that we're on. So we're going to come to that point. I'm going to leave just a couple of minutes for questions. We've covered a lot of material. I don't know if I can answer your questions. Michael may be able to speak. Questions, discomfort, pushback, angst, whatever you want to share. I'm glad to hear it. Yes?
About the American Indians, we wanted the land,
Yeah,
and then Jackson marched them out.
exactly.
The Supreme Court said he couldn't do it, he did it anyway, so
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I think many of us are aware of the fact that Israel's perhaps taking the wrong tack, but this is historic.
Right. So the observation is do we see the similarities with the treatment of our ancestors of the Native American population here, the indigenous population? It's not lost on anyone, I think. It's certainly not lost on Israel. There are many in the Israeli community who would say, and do say to the United States, you don't have any right to lecture us about this. We know what you did to your indigenous population. I think what's different now is that this is happening now. Yes, it's historic, but it's real and current. And that's why many of us feel a sense of urgency, that maybe this colonial battle hasn't yet been fully lost. Because what's coming, as you're going to see, is we are in a time when, if you look at historic Palestine, half the population is Jewish, half the population is non-Jewish Arab. There is no possible way for Israel to remain a democracy and a Jewish state. We are facing an existential crisis for the existence of the State of Israel. They either give up democracy and deny human rights to the majority population, or they expel 6 million Palestinians from historic Palestine, which is what many said they should have done initially. So that's where we're going with it, and that's what we did, right? That's what our ancestors did. We just drove the Native Americans onto reservations, and that's what Israel is doing by pushing the Palestinians into enclaves in the West Bank and Gaza, denying them voting rights, denying them human rights. Just this week, the Israeli Knesset voted to cut the electricity supply to Gaza even further. By hemming these people in, they're doing what we did, I think, to the indigenous population. Yes, sir?
And when you speak about the population, you're talking about the pre-70s or 67 now, defining all of that as what Israel?
If we look at when we talk about historic Palestine now, we're talking about State of Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, the population that exists there, yeah. If you take out the West...
That's where you're having.
Exactly, right. Because that's what Israel has to deal with. 50 years of occupying the West Bank and Gaza, eventually you either have to grant them citizenship, annex the land, and make them a part of your country, or give them their own state, or just say long-term we're going to accept apartheid. We're going to accept this as the existence. We will control this population. And none of those seem like reasonable options. Yes, ma'am.
You
if I can take the coward's way out and punt that to the end of the class, we're going to talk about that. I still believe in nonviolent resistance. I believe in the first intifada, which was largely a nonviolent intifada that Michael's going to talk about. I believe in what's called the cultural intifada now of Palestinian resistance. I believe in the steadfastness of the Palestinian people to say, we're here, we're not going anywhere. Eventually the world is going to recognize that we have human rights like everyone else, and we want our human rights. We want to be allowed to vote, we want to be allowed to have sovereignty, we want to be allowed to select our leaders, we want to be allowed to have freedom. How we get to that, my Israeli physician friends say we're looking at another 50 to 100 years of bloodshed. They said, but I don't know. I want to be more optimistic than that. Yes, sir.
You may want to get to this at a later date, but what is your estimate of the percentage of the population, the two populations, Israeli and Palestinian, who are willing to go along with a two-state solution?
Yeah. So the question is, what is my estimate of the percentage of, the percentage of the population on both sides who want peace, who are looking for some solution, for instance, a two-state solution? I would say that number is plummeting rapidly because of political realities. I would say we don't really know because polls are fraught with problems. We've learned that in our country. So it depends on which pollster you ask and which group you talk to. I will say that in my experience of 22 trips over the course of a lifetime and all the people that I've talked to, that the vast majority of Palestinians are ready to give up on historic Palestine. They'll accept the 22% of the land that's left, but they want a free, independent state of Palestine next to Israel. Vast majority want that. They want it without violence. They want to get on with their lives and live peacefully. And I would have said up until the current Netanyahu administration that the majority of Israelis were there as well. But I think Israel has shifted far to the right now, and I think it's very hard to determine how many Israelis are willing to live with a two-state solution. So I don't know the answer to that question. I know there are a lot more questions. Michael signaled me that time is up. I'll stick around to chat any more with folks. Thank you, and Mike, thanks for letting me fill in.